Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. For the next 15 minutes, let's take a break from winter and allow ourselves to imagine warmer weather with beautiful flowers and landscapes. Our guest today is going to highlight several books that are perfect for this time of year as we plan for the beauty and bounty of the growing season. Joining me is a frequent contributor to Across the Fence. It is a pleasure to welcome UVM horticulturalist Leonard Perry. Great to see you.
Great to be back.
Now, how do you come up with some of your favorite gardening books?
There are just so many, Judy.
I know.
And I try to pick a diversity, try to pick some favorites. This year I tried to bring everything from design to how-to what I call lay science, or science for the home gardener, which is kind of fun. Also a couple of books that relate to upcoming meetings, and a couple actually that relate to tours we'll talk about I've got coming up this next season.
Great. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the design and actually plants. I love plants. And this one by Kelly Norris, who's the horticulture manager at the Des Moines, Iowa Botanic Garden. He also has run an iris nursery for years, young author, but he has all kinds of exciting new plants in this, and he groups them by several categories like types of plants, about seasons, and about fun uses. And I brought a few examples of these. Here are cannas, one on the right which has a wonderful pink flower contrasting with the foliage, and then the left one called Faison, which you can see the backlining, just phenomenal. So a lot of ways to look at plants. This is one of my favorites. It's called Kiss Me Over the Garden Gate. And a long name, but about 7 to 8 feet. It's an heirloom, but look at that structure. He talks about plant structure, interplanted with grasses. I interplant mine with perennials and annuals. It's an annual, it's self-seeds, but it's a great plant for the garden, very unusual. And irises, here's, as I mentioned, he's an iris fancier and has a nursery you can actually order from. Here's an unusual iris, which I thought was pretty neat and wanted to show as an example of one of those unusual plants. Everything from ferns on the left, the ostrich ferns, which we often take for granted, but planted in a mass, look great to one. People may not know it's called a sweet fern. It's actually a shrub, 3 to 5 foot shrub. It has fern-like leaves on it, and they're kind of fragrant when you bruise them. So just some different woody plants too to add texture to the garden.
Nice.
And so then next, brought another book that is Vermont author Ed Smith. We've seen his Vegetable Gardener's Bible. Well, this, as you see, is Vegetable Gardener's Container Bible. And this one he starts with the basics, then he goes into everything from sowing the seeds to, but again, all about containers, to planting, to maintaining, to harvesting. And then as you go through the season, and then he talks about the A to Z of various vegetables and specifics, so you can look up something, then herbs and cut flowers. So this is a great reference if you want to grow in containers, like you see examples here. I grow lettuces like he's showing in window boxes. They're easy to pick, they're away from the bunnies. Just an example, some colored foliages and combinations, whether you use a colored chard up on the Swiss chard or combining on the right the basil and the lettuce. Some great combinations. You see some wonderful illustrations in this. Some illustrations on how to. This is showing covering to keep insects off. For that you can use frost cloth or this, it's called remade, but this spunbound fabric. But just showing real easy how to. Keeping the deer out of the garden. That's a big one for a lot of people, and showing about how to set up an electric fence. So just some good examples from that one. And then, so that's the how-to, and then here's the science one. This is a colleague out in Washington State, Linda Chalker-Scott, and she's an extension colleague, but she's written a great book about basically why plants do what they do. And I brought some examples of that. A question I often get is hydrangeas. How can I make them blue? Well, it's only some varieties, and you keep the soil acidic, but what that's actually doing is increasing the aluminum. That's what turns those blue, is aluminum in the soil being more available. We've actually shown this before on one of our tip shows. These people always ask about, what are these bumps on my leaves? Well, they're actually galls. The insect lays eggs in there and releases a chemical that makes all this growth. And that growth around the eggs actually provides nutrition and housing for those eggs as they hatch. And I love it. She refers to it as botanical room and board. But that's caused by insects, galls on leaves. This is kind of cool. It's a microscope slide, but plant cells on the leaf. This is how they breathe. They exchange gases through these cells where you see a little slit. That's called a stomate, and that's how they open and close, and that's how basically the plants breathe. So I thought people might like to see that. It's a lot of fun pictures. Why are plants basically green? Well, they absorb all the different wavelengths except for green. They reflect that back, and she talks about how they use those different wavelengths of light. And this is a great one. Again, something we've talked about, especially in relation to poinsettias. It's the day length that affects flowering on a lot of plants. And actually, it's the night length. So on the top, you see long night, big part of the pie there. That makes poinsettias as well as chrysanthemums bloom, but you see the iris don't. But if you interrupt that night with, some light or have a much shorter night, then the chrysanthemums and the poinsettias won't bloom, but the iris will. So it's just fascinating, some of these different things you can find out about how plants, and I'm looking forward to rereading a lot of these this winter.
Now, throughout the year, you get a chance to interview a lot of authors who come to the university. One of them is Doug Tallamy, and Doug's first book is about using native plants to sustain wildlife. I love that.
Yeah, it's a great
book. Topics. The most important one, though, is to convince people that plants matter. We have viewed one important part of what plants do, and that is that they're pretty. We treat them as decorations, but we've forgotten all the ecological functions that they have. And everywhere we manage our landscapes, we have forgotten that. And now it's such a huge area that we're suffering from the lack of the ecosystem services that these plants provide. This book focuses on one of those ecosystem services, the ability to maintain food webs so that other living things can continue to exist. We have a real drain on our biodiversity in this country because we're taking away habitat. And now the only way we're going to save these species is to share the spaces where we live and we work, and to a lesser extent where we farm. So this book talks about the relationships between plants, how they capture energy from the sun, pass it on to other organisms, how insects are a very important component of that. Which is another piece of news for most gardeners. We see insects as the enemy. We've got to kill them all the time, but we will not exist as human beings on this planet if we get rid of all of our insects. So we need to plant plants that the insects can use so that other things can eat those insects so that we have the other things around. If you want chickadees in your backyard, if you want them to reproduce in your yard, it takes 4,800 caterpillars to feed one clutch of chickadees through to maturity. 4,800 caterpillars. So you've got to make those caterpillars in your yard. What are the caterpillars eating? They're eating the plants that they co-evolved with. And most species of caterpillars, 90% of them are really specific about what they can eat. So if we bring in plants from Asia, our caterpillars can't eat those, which means you're not going to get your 4,800 caterpillars and you won't have chickadees. And that's just one species of bird. 96% of our birds are feeding their young insects, mostly caterpillars. So if we want birds around, we've got to change the way we landscape with the bulk of our plants, particularly the big woodies.
Okay, so not just the flowers, but the shrubs and trees as well.
Yeah, that is where most of those caterpillars are developing, yeah.
So it sounds like fascinating. I'm sure there's just lots more in this. What brought this to mind? Why did you feel compelled to and write this? I know you're doing some research on this area.
Right. Well, I am an entomologist, and I have studied how insects interact with plants for a number of years. But what really stimulated this was that my wife and I moved to a new house, more or less in the country. It's now surrounded by suburbia, but it had been mowed for hay, and by the time we moved in, it was overrun with invasive species. So autumn olive and oriental bittersweet and multiflora rose, Japanese honeysuckle, and so on. And these are all plants from Asia. And the first thing I noticed in my yard is that none of our local insects were able to eat those. We started doing research on this. The news media picked it up, and people started to invite me to give talks, and then people said, we want to read about this, and I said, there's nothing to read. So finally I said I'd write a pamphlet, and the pamphlet became the book, and that's how it is.
Well, if you're just joining us, I'm visiting with Leonard Perry about gardening books, and earlier you mentioned books relating to upcoming meetings.
We have a couple meetings that I'd like to let people know about, and first is the Vermont Flower Show coming up every other year. This year, March 3 through 5 in Essex Junction. More information as year goes on that. And then April 8th, the King's Garden Symposium in Fort Ticonderoga. The keynote speakers for both have books and have brought examples today. The first, Vermont Flower Show, Claudia West has written this, Planting in a Post-Wild World, basically about how to put together plant combinations to mimic nature, like plants grow naturally. And she's really talked about that a lot. And we see some examples, putting a fir next to an aster. So a lot of great design. She's a landscape architect as well, so you can see combinations. And here's some Brunner, some foam flowers, those with the white flowers mixed in with ferns. So a lot of color and texture, very naturalistic looking, showing some diagrams how plants get along in nature, above ground and below ground. You know, roots grow different depths, so they don't all compete for the same nutrients. And then here's an example using masses of plants and repetition to create that natural effect. So she gives a lot of design tips in her book. And in New York City, here's a courtyard in a building, the white birch mimicking the building, and then the underground with the ground covers, ferns, and sedges, very naturalistic looking. And then the second book is Lee Reich, who's actually going to be the keynote speaker at the Fort Ticonderoga Symposium, the King's Garden. And this pruning book, he's not only a hands-on gardener with a lot of great tips, but he's got a PhD, so he's got a lot of good information behind it. And it brought a few examples to show wonderful illustrations. Here's a couple of types of shearing on hedges. He goes into a lot of details about why you do what you do, when you do it. Edible plants, small fruits is another one. Plants, especially, he's written books on that, but showing how to prune those properly, showing different tools. Here's one of my favorite. It's one of those long pruning tools that you can reach in, grab thorny things or flowers and pull them out. And then here's an example of some heading versus thinning cuts and pinching, what those do on plants. So you can learn about those terms, and we talk about pruning back to above a bud. Well, this shows the right and the wrong way to do it. So again, you can learn a lot of different things about pruning.
At the end of the show, we're going to give details on how our viewers can hear these authors in person. But now you have information on your 2017 garden tours and books that relate to those.
Got a few garden tours in the works. In fact, the first is already online. People can register for a shopping trip in May 22nd in northwestern Vermont. But also in June, we have one, Gardens of Seacoast, Maine and New Hampshire. And then end of July, Philadelphia area gardens. More details on those. But one of the things we're going to do on the Maine trip is have a talk on the tour by Carrie Mendez. Some people may have heard her. She speaks in this area a lot, the right size flower garden. And then we have examples before and after her own garden. Again, a hands-on gardener, lots of great tips. Here, just all containers, tropicals. Can get some great eye candy and inspiration and ideas. A lot of diagrams, very simple plans and pictures of the plants and information, how to put them together. So how to make the right size garden. And then on the Pennsylvania trip, this garden is really worth seeing, even if you just look at the book. It's a great picture book, something great for winter time to look at. We just look at some of the pictures from various seasons. There is a statue in fall and then in winter, looking at the various textures and lines of the different plants. And then in springtime, this time of year, it's just wonderful. I love seeing these springtime pictures with the tulips and all the spring shrubs. But this is, again, Chanticleer. It's near Philadelphia. A lot of design ideas. Here's a window box just with succulents. They're very popular. And then, again, the cascading ponds they have there at Chanticleer in the springtime. So even if you go one time a year, you can see other times a rock garden with lavender and milkweeds. And then this is interesting, this meandering beds they always do with a crop. When I was there, I saw cotton. This is actually the sorghum grain, a dwarf red variety. So it shows you can really think out of the box, and this is where a lot of designers get ideas. This is one of the gardens. And then you see here the prairie drop seed grass grown in masses. That's a grass we can grow here. You could do it even on a smaller scale at home, but with the lines of those beds matching the walk there, just some beautiful design ideas, plants, Chanticleer Gardens in Pennsylvania.
Now, remind folks again about upcoming events and where they can get information on tours.
Okay, again, on my website, the Perry's Perennials, I've got information on the events page, and I'll be updating that as more events come along. And also I've got a section just on the garden tour, so people can get on the list to hear about those. They can register for the one in May. Again, we have the flower show in the King's Garden at Fort Ticonderoga in March and April this year, and then we have the garden tours May, June, and July. So different links, day trip, and then we'll probably have one in September too to Montreal, but haven't gone that far yet.
All right, we've got about a minute left, and what should people be thinking about this time of year as far as the upcoming growing season?
Well, I think, just again, if you want to get some great ideas, the Vermont Flower Show, I should mention that a bit more. The theme this year is going to be Neverland, as in Peter Pan. They're expanding, they're going to be bigger, and have a whole room just dedicated to the display, which should be awesome. You can get a lot of ideas there. We're going to have a couple dozen speakers again. You can get a lot of ideas what to do about the season. Now just, look at those seed catalogs. Don't get carried away. Don't over-order like I always tend to do. Remember, you've got to sow those, plant them. But it is a great thing to be thinking about. And again, looking at these books and many more that are out there, you can get a lot of ideas.
Leonard, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.